Okay, the second thing we're going to talk about today, the next thing we're going to talk about is the social gospel movement. We're going to kind of get into the roots of the progressive movement. Where did it come from? The first group we're going to mention is the social gospel movement. It is a Protestant Christian movement. Basically, this is a group of non-Catholic churches that are leading this, non-Catholic Christian churches that are leading this. They are trying to reach out to the poor. They're trying to help out those who are less fortunate than them. They're trying to fight for equality. That would include women as well. It is an intellectual movement. Basically, it's asking people to look at things the way they are, understand, and try to affect change. Thinking about problems, thinking through problems. They sought to apply Christian principles when dealing with social justice issues. So they would apply things like turning the other cheek, pacifism, that kind of thing. They would apply Good Samaritan rules. If you see somebody in need, even if they are of a different race, even if they are a different background or religion, stop and help them. So the Good Samaritan law would be there. The Golden Rule would be another thing. Do unto others as you'd see, have them do unto you. You can see here there's a list of things that you just saw just a second ago on that slide. Economic inequality, poverty, alcoholism, crime, racial tensions, slums, bad hygiene, child labor, inadequate labor unions, poor schools, and the danger of war. So they're all against this they're pacifists, they're against war, they're against all these things. One of the key things I want you to see here is going to be this right here. Alcoholism. Big part of social gospel movement is pushing against alcoholism. Now, what's going to happen later on with alcoholism is it's going to be eventually done away with. And does anybody know what that's called? Be progressivism. Now, sorry, not progressivism. That would be prohibition. Sorry, my bad. Prohibition would be the thing that comes along later. We're doing away with alcohol. That's prohibition. It starts its roots even before the social gospel movement, but the social gospel movement is common and it's present around the time that prohibition is going to happen. So they get a lot of credit for finally pushing the ball over the hill on that one and getting things taken care of. So all of these people that we're going to see here are represented are great examples of social gospel movement proponents. And the first guy we're going to look at here is Richard T. Ely. Richard T. Ely was an anti-capitalist. That is a nice way of putting that he was a socialist or communist. Basically, he was opposed to free market capitalism, and he thought that that was causing a great rift in society. He's an economist, and he wanted more government. Now, this is an interesting thing. You have a Christian organization that is actually pushing for stronger government involvement, or a Christian leader that's pushing for stronger government involvement. There's a lot of his belief system that tends to line up less with traditional American economic values and more with your socialist leanings and that kind of thing. That could cause some issues for some of the social gospel movement people. That's Richard T. Ely. Second guy. It's a guy named Washington Gladden. Washington Gladden, aside from having an awesome beard with little hair on top, is a pastor who opposed segregation. And he was also an opponent to Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed, what was he the political boss of? Tammany Hall. Okay, so Tammany Hall, all the way back there, Boss Tweed. Washington Gladden is a pastor. This right here, opposing segregation, this is an important concept for you to understand. He is a white pastor who is supporting breaking up, or not breaking up, but combining schools against segregation. He wanted African Americans and white people to come along together. We're talking 1901, 1902. Early 1900s, here's a guy who's standing up and he's speaking out and he's saying, we need to end this now. It's not fair. It's not right. Next guy. Walter Rauschenbusch. He's a pastor. He believed this: show people Jesus, not preach fire and brimstone. Now, if you go back and you were to pull up any sermons from the late 1800s, you're going to find what's called fire and brimstone preaching. Maybe you've been to a church where it's like this, where there's a lot of yelling, there's a lot of threatening, there's a lot of fear used. Fire and brimstone of, if you don't change your ways, you're going to burn in hell. That's fire and brimstone. Rauschenbusch is basically coming along and saying, we need to not do that. We need to show people a gentler way of doing things, a nicer way of doing that. Obviously, that's going to back into social justice. Don't judge a person for alcoholism. Don't condemn them for alcoholism. Show them a better way to live a life. Show them compassion. Help them to find their way out of that particular sickness. So that's going to be where Rauschenbusch is coming in. And he's going to really push that social justice side of things that still falls sort of within the framework of traditional American, as opposed to our first guy, Eli, the first Eli guy. Okay, Josiah Strong, our last guy. Unfortunately, there's no picture of Josiah Strong that I can find, so he gets the Facebook anonymous guy. He's a pastor, he's an author, and he had promoted the missionary approach to social justice. So when you put all these guys together, they're creating sort of this nice big stew of what things are going to do. You've got Joseph T. Eli, the first guy, who's basically saying capitalism is killing us, it's destroying us. So he's going to be fighting against corruption in business and trying to do away with that kind of thing. You have Washington Gladden, who's fighting against the political corruption. So you've got business corruption with Eli, you've got Gladden going up against political corruption with Boss Tweed. Then you've got Rauschenbusch coming in there and saying, we've got to show compassion, we've got to show love for people. And then finally we have Josiah Strong, who's stepping in there and he's tying it all together and saying, we need to treat these people here in the United States the same way we would anybody we encountered overseas in a mission. Okay, social justice missionary. Go to the people, meet the people's needs, show them love, show them compassion, rescue them from dire situations, and that's how we win things over. That's how we make this a better place to live. Second group is a group called the Muckrakers. Now the Muckrakers, we'll talk about a few of them in specific here in just a minute, but Muckrakers are reporters, okay? For the most part, they're just reporters. They may be a photojournalist, and one of the guys we'll talk about is a very famous photojournalist. You may also see them as investigative reporters. Some of them are actually authors, they're writers, fiction writers. They all use their information, they use the things that they've seen in society, they've seen in the world to try to expose what's going on in the deep, dark underbelly of the world. Okay? Now, before we get into this, basically what we want you to see is this. Roosevelt made a speech at one point, and he actually is given credit for coining the phrase muckraker. Okay? And what he said was this. In Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, you may recall the description of the man with the muckrake, the man who could look no way but downward with the muckrake in his hands, who was offered a celestial crown for his muckrake, but who would neither look up nor regard the crown he was offered, but continued to rake to himself the filth of the floor. Now, Roosevelt had this love-hate relationship with muckrakers. He was actually friends with several of them. A couple of guys we're going to mention here in a little bit. Jacob Riis is one, and Lincoln Steffens is another. These are two guys that Roosevelt was not just acquaintances with, he was friends. They had helped him early on in his career when he was police commissioner of New York. He built a strong relationship with them. He's going to utilize them to help push his agenda. But at the same time, the muckrakers are also talking about some of the same people that Roosevelt works with. And while Roosevelt is opposed to the political machine, as his career goes along, he finds himself working with them more than he liked. And so he found himself exposed to this. Now, when the muckrakers found a topic that Roosevelt and them disagreed on, they went after him full force. They weren't afraid to go after him. So Roosevelt says this speech, and he basically says, look, you guys are raking muck for the sake of muck. Now, I want to stop right here and just explain, what is muck? Muck is disgusting. It's awful. It's mud, it's sewage, it's filth, it's gross. I grew up on a farm, and it used to be when it would rain a whole lot and we had a lot of animals in one spot, the ground would become semi-solid, okay? And it would be a combination of dirt and mud and all the rain that's come in and the waste from the animals that were there, and you'd step into it and your boot would sink deep, 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 okay? And I remember there were multiple times as a child I would sink into the mud 6-8 inches because it was that deep, and I'd try to pull my boot out and my boot would just disappear into the mud, which is incredibly gross because then you're barefoot in the muck. Muck is bad. Okay, it's gross. And this whole thing about muckrakers is these people are pulling back the muck to show everybody how bad it really is. Roosevelt's argument here is the muckrakers are just playing around the muck. They're not actually doing anything. They're not exposing anything anymore. They're just doing it because that's all they know now. So that was sort of the love-hate relationship. Generally, muckrakers, investigative reporters, they sought to expose corruption and social problems. So they're going to be writing stories. They're going to be taking pictures. They're going to show people the way the world really is, politics and all. It's a term used by Roosevelt, but not until March 7th of 1906. That's really the first time that he publicly comes out and says, muckrakers and I are not on good terms right now. They're coming after me. I'm being accused of things. It's time to attack them. They are a friend and a foe of the progressives. I mentioned earlier Roosevelt would use them for his benefit. He would there were times where he would take Jacob Riis, the photographer, along with him, take pictures of things that he saw, to take pictures of corruption that he found within the police department when he was a commissioner. Basically that kind of thing. They worked together, but then at the same time, muckrakers decided that to be too beholden to any political party was not a good thing. And so we've got to be honest. We've got to be truth bearers. Again, comparing a muckraker to a yellow journalist. Muckrakers are going to be looking for truth's sake. Journalists are going to be looking for a better story for money's sake. Yellow journalists versus muckrakers. One of them is in it for truth, justice, and the American way. Muckraker. One of them is in it for the almighty dollar, yellow journalists. Examples of some of the Muckrakers, some of the more famous Muckrakers. First guy, Upton Sinclair, wrote a book called The Jungle. Talked about meatpacking industry situations. It was a book of fiction, but it was based off of stories and things that he'd actually seen in real life. Bad stories. This book described things like, I think one of the stories was rats being in the food. There was something about like walking all over the food, I believe. Some pretty extreme situations. It was bad. It was enough to gross people out. It was almost like a horror story of how bad things were. Now, because of his writing, because of this, and because his book became incredibly popular, incredibly famous, he actually is sort of credited with pushing through one of the agendas of Roosevelt, one of the plans of Roosevelt, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. Both of these were things that they still affect us today. So if you go to the store and you look at the ingredients on the back of your whatever it is you buy, like say you buy a box of cereal and you have all the list of ingredients, that's because of the Pure Food and Drug Act, okay? That kind of thing says truth in advertising. You've got to tell us what it is, okay? So that's one of the things that this passed because of this. Now, Upton Sinclair is a socialist. He's not too terribly unlike Richard T. Ely from earlier, where he's basically saying, look guys, this thing right here, capitalism, not working. Second Muckraker is a lady named Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell, quick way to remember her name, she is famous because she went after Standard Oil. Standard Oil was run by who? Rockefeller, correct. Rockefeller is the guy who was running that. So Ida Tarbell, tar deals with oil, petroleum. Ida Tarbell, she went against the oil industry, specifically Standard Oil run by Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller. Exposed John D. Rockefeller's company as a corporate bully, as a monopoly, basically by getting a hold of bucket loads of information, reams and reams of paper of resources from the particular business of Standard Oil. She went through every bit of it, she exposed it, she publicized it, took down Standard Oil. Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives. Riis, again, friend of Roosevelt's, he's a photographer. Now, he's a significant photographer because he begins to use flash photography. Now, the reason why that's important is he was going into slums, dark, dimly lit, dank places. He would walk in there, and there's not any lights in there. There's not electricity. It's very, very rough for these people. Very, very poor, very, very dark, very, very unsanitary. Riis would go in, he'd set up his camera, flash photography, pop, and you'd see all the exposed cracks and crevices and dirt and filth everywhere. And then he would try to sell this to newspapers, and no one wanted to publish it. So what Riis ends up doing is Riis ends up setting up a sort of a moving exhibition, an exhibition that goes around the United States. He would set up and he would show these pictures to people. And who would he invite? The middle class and the rich. People that are susceptible to the progressive movement. He would invite them in, show them the pictures, and for the first time ever, people could see, as the book he eventually published was titled, How the Other Half Lives. And it shocked people. How could people live in this situation? How could 12 to 13 people be living in a 200 square foot room? How could you have rats crawling across you as you sleep at night? How could you deal with the sewage flowing down the middle of the street in the back alleys of an ethnic ghetto in New York? How could you live that way? And Riis shows people how to do that. Next. Thomas Nast. Now Nast we talked about briefly before. He was the cartoonist who went after our big old friend, Mr. Boss Tweed. Nast goes after Tweed. You can see some of these images. That guy's Tweed. All these are Tweed. He considered the father of the American cartoon, early American political cartoonist, but he's also famous because he created some other things. He created the elephant for the Republican Party. He basically named the Republican Party elephant, animal mascot as an elephant. And he also created the modern depiction of Santa Claus. The picture that you see of Santa Claus on Coke bottles and everything like that, Thomas Nast. Lincoln Steffens, another buddy of Theodore Roosevelt's. Lincoln Steffens wrote a book called Shame of the Cities. He was exposing municipal government corruption, municipalist city. Basically, Stephens was writing off the things that he saw when Roosevelt was police commissioner and bringing that to light. And last, Ida B. Wells. Don't confuse Ida B. Wells with Ida Tarbell. Ida B. Wells was an African-American woman. She wrote about lynching in the South in the early 1900s. Exposed this, showed everybody how bad it really was. Another important thing, Wells, 71 years before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, Ida B. Wells was on a train, was asked to move from the white section to the black section. She refused to give up her seat. Similar story. We don't talk about her in history books today, probably because it's a long time ago. But the truth of the matter is, Ida B. Wells set a standard that Rosa Parks would later follow up on in civil rights movement, when we talk about that later on. But also a very courageous woman, very willing to write stories and stand up for things that she knew might very well get her or her family killed. And so it takes a lot of courage to do that. So definitely a muckraker of high esteem.